Welcome to Module 12. In this module, we're focusing on social media measurement and analytics. Throughout this course, we've talked about developing strategy, creating content, choosing platforms, working with influencers, managing crises, and building relationships with audiences. But there is an important question that should follow all of those activities. Did it work? Measurement helps us answer that question. We're going to look at how we measure social media performance, evaluate what the data means, use those insights to improve our strategies, and ultimately demonstrate the value of our communication efforts. So, why do we measure? One reason is simply to understand what worked. Which content performed well, which platforms helped us reach the right audiences, which strategies generated meaningful engagement. But measurement also helps us improve. If something isn't working, the data can help us identify where adjustments need to be made. Measurement also helps us demonstrate value. Organizations invest time, people, and money into social media. As communication professionals, we should be able to explain what that investment is accomplishing. Ultimately, measurement should help us make better decisions. One of the most important things I want you to remember from this module is that measurement starts with the goal, not the metric. Don't begin by saying, we need more likes. Start by asking what the organization is trying to accomplish. Maybe the business goal is to increase sales. The communication goal might be to increase awareness of a new product. Your social media objective might then be to drive qualified traffic to the product page. Only after you've established those goals should you decide which metrics will tell you whether the strategy worked. Your metrics should always connect back to what you were trying to accomplish. This brings us to the difference between having data and having useful data. Social media platforms give us an enormous amount of information. We can count followers, likes, views, comments, shares, impressions, and many other things. But a large number doesn't necessarily mean that you've achieved your goal. If your objective was awareness, reach may be important. If your objective was interaction, engagement may matter more. If you're trying to change perceptions, you might examine sentiment. And if your goal is to generate action, clicks, or conversions may be more meaningful. So don't choose a metric simply because it's easy to count. Measure what matters to the objective. Before you can demonstrate improvement, you need to know where you started. That's your baseline. For example, imagine that you tell your client that the campaign generated 5,000 website visits. Is that good? We don't know. If the website normally receives 500 visits during that period, 5,000 could be an outstanding result. But if it normally receives 10,000, we have a very different story. The same applies to followers, engagement, sentiment, share of voice, and conversions. Your baseline provides context. Without it, you may have numbers, but you don't necessarily know whether those numbers represent progress. Another important distinction in communication measurement is the difference between outputs and outcomes. Outputs tell us what we produced. How many posts did we publish? How many videos did we create? How many people were potentially exposed to our message? Those numbers can be useful, but they don't tell us whether anything actually changed. Outtakes move us closer to what audiences received or understood. Outcomes examine whether there was a change in awareness, attitudes, behavior, or another communication objective. And ultimately, we want to understand impact. What value did that change create for the organization or its stakeholders? Strong measurement moves beyond simply counting activity. Let's pause here for a moment to discuss the Barcelona Principles. The Barcelona Principles were developed because the communication profession needed stronger standards for measurement and evaluation. Now, you don't need to memorize every principle word for word. What I want you to understand is the larger philosophy behind them. Set measurable goals. Focus on outcomes rather than simply outputs. Use both quantitative and qualitative evidence when appropriate. Connect communication to organizational impact where possible. And make sure your measurement methods are transparent and valid. The principles also rejected the idea that advertising value equivalency, or AVE, represents the true value of communication. The larger lesson is simple: communication value should be demonstrated through meaningful evidence. Now, let's look at some of the metrics you will encounter frequently. Reach helps us understand the audience exposed to content. Impressions tell us how often that content was displayed. Engagement captures interactions such as likes, comments, shares, and saves. Clicks can tell us whether someone moved beyond simply seeing the content and took another step. Sentiment helps us understand the tone of conversations surrounding the brand. And conversions tell us whether someone completed a desired action. Notice that these metrics answer different questions. That's why there isn't one universal best social media metric. Reach and impressions are sometimes confused, so let's distinguish between them. Reach generally refers to the number of unique people or accounts that saw your content. Impressions refer to the total number of times the content was displayed. So one person could see the same post several times. That person contributes once to reach, but may contribute several impressions. Neither number is automatically better than the other. They simply tell you different things about exposure. On the other hand, engagement tells us how audiences are interacting with our content. But even here, we shouldn't treat every interaction as identical. A like is a relatively quick reaction. A comment requires more effort and can create conversation. A share can amplify your message to other audiences. A save may suggest that someone found the content valuable enough to revisit later. So instead of simply saying, "This post received a lot of engagement," look more closely at what kind of engagement occurred and whether that behavior supports your objective. Sentiment analysis looks at whether conversations surrounding a brand, organization, or issue are generally positive, neutral, or negative. This can be especially useful when you're measuring reputation, but sentiment isn't perfect. Language is complicated. Sarcasm, humor, cultural references, and context can make automated classification difficult. AI tools can help analyze very large volumes of conversation, but they can also misinterpret meaning. So, just as we discussed in Module 11, technology can help identify patterns, but human judgment remains important. Share of voice gives us a competitive perspective. Instead of only asking how many people are talking about your brand, we ask how much of the relevant conversation belongs to your brand compared with competitors. For example, Imagine three competing brands are being discussed within the same product category. One brand may account for half of that conversation, while the others divide the remaining half. That gives us additional context about visibility and presence within the marketplace. But remember, share of voice tells us how much conversation you're receiving. You may still need sentiment and other measures to determine whether that conversation is positive. Consider this: advocacy takes us beyond basic engagement. An advocate isn't simply someone who follows your account. This is someone willing to support, recommend, defend, or create content around your brand. We might see advocacy through recommendations, positive reviews, organic mentions, referrals, or UGC content. You might also encounter measures such as Net Promoter Score, which ask about someone's likelihood of recommending a brand or organization. Advocacy can be particularly valuable because it tells us something about the strength of the relationship audiences have developed with the brand. Eventually, organizations may want to know what social media contributes to the bottom line. Some of that value can come from revenue. Social content may contribute to purchases, registrations, donations, or other financial outcomes, but value can also come from cost savings. Social customer service, for example, may help an organization resolve issues efficiently. And there may be other forms of business value, such as lead generation and customer retention. The important point is not to force every social interaction into a dollar amount. If you're going to claim that social media created financial value, you need credible evidence connecting the activity to that result. Conversions are another area where we need to look beyond immediate sales. A macro conversion is usually the major action we ultimately want someone to take. That could be making a purchase, submitting an application, subscribing to a service, or making a donation. A microconversion is a smaller action that may move someone toward that larger outcome. Someone might sign up for an email list, download a guide, create an account, or view a product page. None of those actions necessarily generates immediate revenue, but they may indicate movement through the customer journey. So don't assume that the only valuable conversion is an immediate purchase. Once someone converts, another question appears: what contributed to that action? That's where attribution becomes important. Maybe someone first discovered the organization through an Instagram post, clicked through to the website, returned several days later, and then completed a purchase. Social media may have contributed to the conversion even though the purchase didn't happen immediately after the first post. Attribution helps us understand the relationship between communication activity and audience action. And as customer journeys become more complicated, attribution becomes more challenging as well. One practical way to improve attribution is through UTM tracking parameters. UTMs are pieces of information added to a URL that help analytics tools identify where traffic came from. For example, the source might tell us that the clicks came from Instagram. The medium might identify social media as the type of channel. The campaign might identify a particular product launch, and content can distinguish between different versions of creative. The important thing to understand is that UTMs allow us to connect traffic and conversions more precisely to specific communication activities. Here's a simple example. Imagine we're promoting a fall campaign on Instagram. We might identify the source as Instagram, the medium as social, the campaign as fall launch, and perhaps the content as video A. When someone clicks that tagged link, the analytics system receives the information. Now, instead of simply knowing that someone arrived on the website, we have more context about where that person came from and which campaign or content helped drive the visit. You don't need to memorize a complicated URL. What I want you to understand is what the different parameters allow us to track. Consistency is extremely important when using UTMs. Imagine one person on your team labels the source Instagram, another uses lowercase I in Instagram, and someone else uses IG. Your analytics system may treat those as different sources, even though your team intends them to represent the same platform. That's why organizations should establish naming conventions before campaigns begin. Decide how sources, mediums, campaigns, and other parameters will be written, and then use that convention consistently. Clean data begins with consistent tracking. AI also changes the way organizations analyze social media data. It can help summarize large data sets, as we've been mentioning throughout this lecture, identify usual patterns, compare performance across content, and potentially identify trends that deserve closer attention. This can save communication professionals considerable time. But we need to apply the same principle we've discussed in other modules. AI can help identify patterns, but people, humans, still need to interpret what those patterns mean. A tool might tell you that engagement increased by 40%. Your job is to determine why it increased, whether the increase matters, and what the organization should do next. Keep in mind that data without interpretation isn't strategy. To recap, start by setting your goals. Establish a baseline so you know where you're beginning. Select metrics that actually connect to objectives. Track performance consistently, and then interpret the results. Finally, use what you've learned to optimize your strategy. Maybe the data tells you to change your content. Maybe you need to shift resources to another platform. Maybe you discover that your audience responds to something you hadn't anticipated. The purpose of measurement isn't simply to produce a report filled with numbers. As communication professionals, our job is to explain what those numbers mean, why they matter, and what we should do next.